As someone who has gained a mid-sized reputation on YouTube for analyzing shows like Avatar: The Last Airbender or The Legend of Korra, I have a lot of people on this platform who want me to talk about this animated show or that. They want me to talk about every notable cartoon that releases, which I suppose I should be flattered by. I admit that there is a big part of me that just wants to go back to reading Dickens for class and watching the third season of Succession again. But since a lot of the shows I regularly talk about on this channel are on hiatus right now, and considering quite a few people have been wondering if I am going to talk about Centaurworld, I decided to go and watch that show, and it's fine. It's good. Its flaws are not easy to ignore, but it has some really interesting elements, and I want to like it as a musical lover. I will admit that its attempts to balance the light and the dark, the trivial and the grave, dramatic and ridiculous, could seem a bit amateurish and awkward at times. And to a certain extent, this extends even to elements of the show I really like. Today I will talk about what I find is the most interesting part of the show to me, and what the show was trying to do, and how I believe it could have been more effective at doing it. I am, of course, talking about the show's fascinating, nightmarish villain, the Nowhere King. This villain dies at the end of Season 2, and I was left feeling like the show did not really have a firm grasp on what it exactly wanted to do with this villain. If they had just wanted to make him an evil overlord cackling maniacally, then having him die right at the end of Season 2 and having peace restored to the land would be a rather satisfying ending. But the show is not content with that. It takes time to acknowledge the bigotry the Nowhere King faced and the resentment and exclusion that drove him to bitterness and resentment, and gradually, over time, that bitterness and resentment boiled up and led to the nihilistic, destructive impulses that spur the Nowhere King throughout the events of Centaurworld. This quest for destruction and vengeance is so overwhelming that it even leads to the corruption of the Centaur King's physical form. Because the show is willing to acknowledge all of this, its decision to just have our heroes celebrate right at the end of Season 2 feels a little bit callous and underthought. Of course, those who have suffered trauma can also inflict trauma. That's often how it happens. Those who cause a lot of suffering in the world are not usually cartoon villains, cackling as they count their absurd stacks of money and indulge in their own hedonistic narcissism. If you look hard enough at pretty much anyone, you will see a history of lamentations and a lot of bitterness. You will see a desperate yearning to find some semblance of stability and control in an ever-changing world that does not care if you're happy or if those you love are there for you. I have been on quite a Succession kick recently, as I just said, so I will quote one of my favorite articles on the show written by the ever-incisive Sam Adler-Bell. It is a particularly contemporary myopia that we tend to ascribe moral innocence to the traumatized, given that trauma is our only guaranteed inheritance, and almost always the reason we do harm. So yes, of course it is a compelling idea that the Centaur King is not this histrionic, Manichaean villain, but rather a figure whose anger and rage comes from a sense of bitterness and exclusion. directed at him from those whose acceptance he wanted to gain. And of course, just because a villain has suffered and has undergone a lot of sorrow and lamenting and grief does not mean that villain's negative action should be ignored or that this villain doesn't necessarily need to be stopped. This contradiction between the acknowledgement of how someone has suffered and the moral imperative to still stop them from doing more harm is at the root of a lot of great tragedy. But I'm not sure that's something this show in particular was ready to handle. There is a major discrepancy in this show between its form and the urging of that form to resolve everything peacefully, and the show's acknowledgement of how trauma and rage and exclusion can drive someone to moral extremes. Discrepancies like this have become particularly common in a lot of stories made recently. There is a real desire in a lot of mainstream media these days to venture into more emotionally complicated territory and not stray away from harsher topics and dealing with those topics in an ambiguous and nuanced light instead of resolving to easy conclusions. And that is, of course, a good thing that should be encouraged. But the problem comes when a show adopts the trappings of taking a more nuanced and comprehensive and broad-minded approach to interpersonal conflict and to our views of these characters and their relationships between each other, but does not actually deliver on the promises implied by those trappings. It's just a costume. It's all surface. There's no depth. Perhaps that's too harsh, but the unavoidable conclusion that one comes to when looking at a lot of so-called more intelligent and emotionally mature mainstream art made these days is that these are works at war with themselves. You have shows like Voltron and to a lesser extent Steven Universe that fall into this trap as much as Centaurworld, wanting to not have black and white villains and heroes, not wanting simple moral clarity, but also not really being willing to engage with the more philosophical implications of these villains not being 100% evil and having a lot of fascinating points and reasonable objections that the heroes should deal with. But it's not just animation. Look at any Marvel movie these days and you'll see a lot of the same conflicts play out within the work itself. It cannot really decide what it wants to be. The funniest example of this for me is the first two Tom Holland Spider-Man movies. The villains in those movies are haggard, broken people who are reasonably resentful that Tony Stark screwed them over. And to their credit, these movies acknowledge to a certain extent that these characters have a point, but because these films are not actually willing to engage with the implications of these characters having a point, these movies make these characters so monstrously extreme and vile that they need to be stopped anyway, even if they have reasonable objections. So the status quo is restored and no one is forced to do some actually serious thinking about the form of these movies and these shows, which tends to default on the old standard of our brave heroes going and fighting the villains and triumphing over them, even if the show wants to say that it's not engaging in simple moral duality. Moral ambiguity needs to matter to the shows that attempt to engage with it. If the Nowhere King must die because of his megalomaniacal, nihilistic, destructive tendencies, even though those tendencies result from the exclusion and ostracization this character has suffered, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? There has to be something aside from, oh, I guess that's kind of sad, I suppose. Shows like Avatar: The Last Airbender, Korra, Gravity Falls, just to name a few mainstream animated shows, are able to both be mainstream, accessible works that are quite enjoyable to engage with, and serious shows that consider how people can hurt each other, and how we're often acting against not just individuals, but structures shaped long before our times. These are shows that organically make their way into moral ambiguity. They do not start from a place of, oh, I want to have some more moral ambiguity, and then just try and work that into a more traditional Manichaean good versus evil structure. Centaurworld, sadly, does not live up to that high standard. There's no real dwelling on the nature of cycles of violence and abuse, or how to actually handle these after effects of ostracization and exclusion beyond heroic platitudes. And I'm not saying the show needs to provide clear answers. In fact, I'm saying the exact opposite, that great art realizes that there are no clear answers to these things. And perhaps I'm putting too much pressure on a very silly and absurd show, but the show itself chose to engage with these topics. I'm not conjuring all of this drama out of thin air. The show chose to tread into this territory, and so it should engage with that territory honestly. If a show is going to make villains who are not just cackling baddies, but flawed and vulnerable people, it needs to engage with the moral and philosophical implications of doing so in the art. Otherwise, well, what's the point? So thank you all for watching. If you'd like to do so today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more videos like this. I'm not really sure what the future of my channel holds, to be honest. I'm not so sure that I want to keep making videos about cartoons that have a dedicated but small audience for the rest of my life. I do want to keep making videos, but I don't know what the future of this channel holds. But I hope you'll stick with me wherever I decide to go with it. So anyway, tune in soon for my next analysis. It will be coming soon. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.